Good evening. My name is Julia Kuehn, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, The Other Shangri-La, Journeys Through the Sino-Tibetan Frontier in Sichuan, organized and hosted by the Asia Society as part of their Asian Pacific book series. We do apologize for the delay in starting. We had technical issues on our end, which required a whole update, but we're all here now and we welcome you extremely and especially warmly. Our author and speaker today is writer, traveler, and photographer Shivaji Das. Shivaji's most recent travel book is The Other Shangri-La, which gave our event its title. It has been hailed by Pulitzer Prize winning. We had technical issues. By Pulitzer Prize winning writer Ian Johnson, no less. It has been hailed as, I quote, an ode to this beautiful alpine region and its people, and a book that helps us, quote, understand the fraught relations between Han Chinese and minority groups and the country's vibrant religious scene. We will hear and see more about this evening. Shivaji's other travel books include Journeys with a Caterpillar, traveling through the islands of Flores and Sumba, Indonesia, Sacred Love, erotic art in the temples of Nepal, and the forthcoming Off the Beaten Track, collecting stories of unheard lives. Das is not just a writer, though. His other sphere of influence lies in work with and for migrants, as in the acclaimed migrant and refugee poetry contests in Singapore and Malaysia, which he conceptualized and has been organizing since 2015. And the Global Migrant Festival, held in Singapore every 2 years, which will go into its second edition this November 2020. Shivaji Das's writings and work with migrants have been published and featured in many international journals and newspapers, including Time, The Economist, the BBC, the South China Morning Post, the Straits Times, Reuters, and many others. He has also been featured in various literary festivals from Japan to Botswana, giving talks on a variety of topics, including travel writing, migrant issues, but also humor. His photographs, in collaboration with his wife, Yolanda Yu, have been exhibited in the US, Malaysia, and Singapore. I'm amazed, given this very full life, that he also manages to have a full-time job as the MD at Frost & Sullivan in Singapore, a digital transformation agency for businesses. So please help me welcome Shivaji Das tonight from his office in Singapore. Welcome, Shivaji. Now, the way that we will run this webinar tonight is that Shivaji will start with an illustrated talk lasting about 20 minutes, followed by a short reading from his book, which I've asked him to do because his prose is so beautiful. Shivaji and I will then have a little chat before we turn to your questions, which you can post, and indeed already have posted, on Slido, www.sly.do, hashtag 00842. 842 is our events number. So here we go. Shivaji, over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to the Asia Society in Hong Kong for organizing this. It's actually my privilege to be talking to all of you about this book and about travel writing, perhaps in general. I would also like to thank all my people who have helped to bring this book along, Connaught Publishers, the editors, the publicizers, and everyone who worked very hard, especially during this time of COVID-19, when it has not been easy, and finally they managed to bring out this book, which is The Other Shangri-La. Before I begin my talk, I would also like to thank just a few people who have been very important for this book. One is, of course, my wife, Yolanda Yu, who was the main interlocutor. She speaks Chinese, and she was the main person who was helping me communicate with all the locals, and also kind of a disciplinarian in the whole trip. And then finally, I would like to thank all the people I met along the way who made this travel possible. Yeah. So if I may, I would like to share a few pictures which will give you a sense of what this whole trip was about and the kind of people and places that we met along the way. So allow me, if I can you see these slides, Julia? All right. So yeah, the book, as you know, it's The Other Shangri-La, it's Journey Through the Sino-Tibetan Frontier in Sichuan. And this is the trip we undertook. We began with Chengdu, and then pretty soon, within a couple of days, we began climbing up. So we went first all the way to Kangding, we went then to Litang, Daocheng, Yadeng, and then we came back to Chengdu, and then we moved to Serta, Bame, and Dhanva. Now, all these places are part of the Tibetan Qinghai Plateau, so the average altitude was about 4,000 meters. And even though the distances seem manageable because of the altitude and because of the conditions of the road, it was not that easy. And in fact, the Sichuan-Tibet highway, which passes through the southern part of this journey, is known to be one of the most dangerous in the world. And drivers in China, they believe that they only become men instead of staying as boys once they have taken this journey along the Sichuan-Tibet highway. Various places along these isolated and scattered settlements have very unique characters, and hopefully during this talk, as well as if you read the book, you'll get a certain flavor of it, both in terms of the nature of these places, which are not just spectacularly beautiful, but also quite distinct from one another, but also the people and the character and the history, all of which have really provided me the enthusiasm to work and write this particular book. So first of all is the beauty of this place, and that's why this whole area, especially towards the south near the Yading Reserve, is claimant to the title of being the Other Shangri-La. So they are these spectacular mountain ranges, the autumn colors, the pristine lakes. So all these were very much part and parcel of our trip, together with the Chinese tourists, of course, who were accompanying us in most of the beautiful parts. They were as much part of the journey. But it's not just these snow mountains, but also these grasslands. This is near the Tagong region, and you can see Yala Mountain in the foreground, which is not the highest mountain in the world at 5,500 meters, but in my opinion, having seen a few mountains here and there, it is one of the most beautiful given its prominence out of the highland that comes. And you can see the yaks in the foreground. But also, as I mentioned, the highway was very much important character in our whole journey, because not just the people we met rubbing shoulders with us in this whole trip, the drivers with all their humor and sense of daredevilry, and also the fallen vehicles which were lined along this whole highway, vehicles which couldn't make it eventually to their final destination. So there's just a snapshot of how the highways look like as we travel through this region. One of the places that we happen to start our journey with is Kangding. And if some of you know, Kangding is the birthplace of perhaps the most famous love song in China, the Kangding love song. And this is the lyrics of the Kangding love song, which is etched into concrete at the city square. And till today, 24/7, they are playing the Kangding love song in loudspeakers in the town square and everywhere else, and people are still dancing around this FG of the Kangding love song. One of the highlights for me during this trip was to be able to stay with the nomads, the Tibetan nomads who inhabit these highlands. And we got to have one of the most spectacular evenings or nights when we stayed in this tent, not just because of the surrounding and the environment we were going through. Over the last few years, over the last few decades, nomads have gone through significant socio-economic changes, and some of them moved away from this nomadic lifestyle and became more settled in the towns and cities. But many of them eventually even decided to come back because they love this lifestyle of self-sufficiency and kind of this pastoral ideal that they really cherish. So this was one of the highlights of our trip. The other very unique place that we visited was this valley of Larung, which happens to be the largest monastery in the world, the largest Buddhist monastery. And at the same time, some people say it's the highest slum in the world as well. Yeah? And again, they have gone through many changes. It started only in the early 1980s and then expanded to more than 10,000 such small houses that you see. And it's quite a sight, not just during snowfall, during midday, but also at night when many of these houses will have these small lamps that you can see lighting out of these. But we are also fortunate that we were perhaps the last group of people who could visit this. As of now, this area is barred for foreigners to go into. Yeah, so in a way, I'm kind of fortunate, even though it's an unfortunate situation, that I was able to witness and also document the situation in Larung. We met very unique characters during our visit to Larung as well, nuns, not just Tibetan monks, but also nuns. And also we met Han monks and novices as well. There's a substantial population of Han monks, novices, and nuns who live in there. This is one of the recurring themes in the whole journey, that we saw how there was this continuous sponsorship and support from the Han community, especially the ones in southeastern part of China, who are now big patrons of the whole Tibetan Buddhism. And that has interesting and multiple possibilities for the evolution of this whole Tibetan Chinese story going forward in the next few years. We also happened to watch sky burial in Tibet province as such. It's not possible for tourists to witness a sky burial, but we were able to witness in this particular land. So in a way, this whole area, one of the reasons that we also chose was that because even though it's Tibet, it's kind of not Tibet. So even though the population is largely Tibetan, it's not part of the Tibet province. And therefore, it is still possible to do independent travel in this region. In Tibet province, as far as I know, for foreigners and tourists, it has to be an organized travel. And that was one of the things that we really enjoyed, being able to go out there on our own and be able to talk to anyone that we felt like. This land happens to be also the arguable place where Gesar thrived. Gesar, or the Epic of Gesar, is perhaps the most famous Tibetan epic. It's not just the longest story in the world, and it's also not yet complete. From what I know, singers are still adding stories of Gesar's heroism into this whole epic that we have today. So a fascinating story. And one of the characters that we came to know through my research while I was looking at this whole place was that Ren Nanxiang, a Han expert, was so impressed with the Epic of Gesar that he decided to marry a Tibetan woman just so that he could listen to the songs and Epic of Gesar, because that was the habit of Tibetan, to sing these songs of Gesar during the wedding night. So one of the suspicion is that he got married to a Tibetan woman just so that he could, on his own, have his own personal rendering of this Epic of Gesar at his own convenience. So again, a fascinating landscape. Towards the end of our trip, we happened to visit the valley around Dhanva. Now, some of the villages around Dhanva, especially the one you see here called Zhonglu, has been termed by, I think, the Chinese National Geographic as the most beautiful village in China. Obviously, that means something for Chinese tourism and the number of tourists who come there every year. But there are still pockets where it is relatively untouched. And you can see these towers, which you can see in not just this part, but also I've seen such similar towers in the Caucasus regions in southern Russia, as in Chechnya and those kind of places. And people just don't know why these stone towers are there. Some say they are meant for the villagers to watch over intruders or people who are invading from nearby regions. But some also say they are for the man in the house to keep an eye for any other male trying to enter their households. So once again, a very beautiful area with a lot of history, because this particular area also is perhaps the seat of an ancient queendom. Yeah? So they had this hereditary line of queens who were ruling this area. And there are some suspicions also that the legend of the Monkey King, where Tripitaka is going towards India to collect scriptures, and on his way finds a certain queendom, and the queen tries to get married to him, and that kind of would have distracted him from his whole initiative of staying bachelor and collecting the scriptures from India, is probably based on this particular region. It's one of the candidates. Even today, the women of these region are considered to be very strong in character as well as the most beautiful. And today, because of this reputation, the city of Dhanba hosts an annual beauty competition. So this Dhanba beauty competition gives the winners golden flower, then there's silver flowers and pomegranate flowers. And every village kind of nominates their beauty into this festival. And then it's like any other talent show or beauty contest where you have to answer some questions and you are judged on various things like your talent and other things. So we happened to accidentally, we didn't know that such a festival was happening at that point of time, but we accidentally happened to bump into this and we managed to interview many of the candidates, the shortlisted ones, the past winners, to get a sense of what this whole legend is all about. Now, incidentally, while Dhanba Valley is known for its beautiful and strong women, the whole area, this part of the Tibetan Qinghai Plateau is known as Kham Tibet, which is also famous for its men. So the Kham Tibetan men are known for their tall physical stature, the essential tall, dark, handsome look, which has made them perhaps the most eligible bachelors or people to have affairs with in the whole of China. And kind of they have been exoticized in novels by the ones written by the Han writer Qi Li. So you have this beauty valley where you have the most beautiful women, and then you have this wider region where you have the most handsome and the most eligible men. So as a result of this, what also happens is that this whole place results in a lot of love triangles and a lot of adulteries and those kind of affairs. And accidentally or somehow we managed to get caught up into one such affair which was happening right before our eyes. So what I'll do is, if Julia, if you allow me, I'll do a short reading from the book, which will give a little sense of what this place is all about. I'll take this maybe about 5 minutes. So this is from the penultimate chapter. And what I'll talk about here is mostly about the beauty contest. So here it goes. Our fellow passengers to Dhanba included 3 elderly Tibetan women who were all wearing elaborate jewelry. Lobo, my Han wife, asked if they dressed like that every day. One of them explained, no, we are going to watch the Dhanba beauty contest. Everyone who goes there dresses well. Our driver, a Sitting Bull look-alike, says, international friend, you are a lucky man. You come here and our city lines up all the beauties for you. Pay me a little bit more for this ride. The women of Dhanba were famous in China for their beauty. Legend has it that a long time ago, when humans and animals could still understand each other, a phoenix flew to Mount Modo, the holiest mountain in the Dhanba region, and then split into thousands of beautiful ladies. The lineage continues till today. Dhanba is now home to the Chiang people, an ancient tribe distinct from the Tibetans and Hans. The tourism industry now marketed the region as the Dhanba Beauty Valley. When Lobo asked our fellow passengers about this reputation, Sitting Bull answered on their behalf, yes, as long as these Dhanba women wash a little, they look good. One of the elderly women said, their skin is very good. It's because of the water. Careful, young lady, Sitting Bull said to Lobo. Therefore, Dhanba is also famous for adultery. Take care of your man. The Dhanba Beauty Contest was conceptualized as the institutionalized response to brand the region for tourists and also for the locals to have some fun. Lobo asked the middle-aged women if they were contestants themselves. No, the women giggled. We are too old. One of our co-passengers remarked, ask our international friend not to have too high expectations. All the beauties of Dhanba have already left to work in the cities. Dhanba had been famous all over China for another reason, for the legend of the Eastern Queendom, an empire run by a lineage of hereditary queens, where women ruled the roost and men merely served as footnotes. When we reached Dhanba, we found it as a small town squeezed between high cliffs and an unruly river whose rumblings drowned every conversation. By the time we reached the town square, thousands had already arrived. Hawkers were floating with large hydrogen balloons. dropping a little closer to earth as their sails went up. Women were selling beads to anyone who still had some spare space on their neck. Instant noodles packs were building up a mountain along the edges. Han policemen formed a fence guarding the entire space. A young officer explained the rules. It's organized every year. Every village here nominates a beauty. I would say there are 100 contestants to begin with. The first round will eliminate 2/3 of them, and the last round, which will be held day after tomorrow, will be announcing the winners who will get a golden flower, and then there will be 2 silver flowers, and 3 will get pomegranate flowers. But it's a pity, our policeman said. We can't watch any of it. We have to always stand guard with our backs facing these beauties. We went inside shamelessly, leaving our full-on policemen behind. The stands were filled chock-a-block with people of all ages. The women in particular were all dressed as if for the wedding, demanding the attention of the world. They wore black velvety jackets and skirts with heavily embroidered edges. Kilogram loads of jewelry hung from their necks. The most noticeable aspect, though, was their hair. Thick plaited strands running over the forehead, decorated by big silver brooches and flaps of cloth called haze, covering the rest of the hair all the way to the mane. Colorful tassels swung from the tips of their cloth. Some in China take issue with the organization of such festivals as being part of the government's attempt to neatly box minorities into exotic singing, dancing stereotypes enjoying 24/7 happiness. One after another, each contestant came to present a cameo to the judges. Most girls sang songs in Tibetan or Mandarin. Some uttered formal prose glorifying Dhanva. A few even tried dancing to Bollywood tunes. One girl made a pigeon disappear. But what the audience really cheered for was when someone stuttered, fell, or forgot their lines. At midday, the results for the first round were announced. The judges noted, as in every contest, this year the quality was especially good, and we had a tough time choosing the winners. But the group of young students standing next to me whispered, this year's contestants were actually the worst they have seen. After the results for the first round were announced, I spoke with Lamo, one of the shortlisted girls. Lamo was studying mass communications in a university in Chengdu and hoped to work in the tourism sector. I'm so happy, Lama said. I've been practicing for this for the last 6 months. The toughest part is to know about Dunbar's history and culture. The judges can ask any question on that. To prepare, I would ask my brothers and cousins, and if they didn't know something, there was always my grandmother. I asked if she had been nervous on stage. Yes, of course. All the people from my village and other villages are here. If something goes wrong, my family would lose face. My village would lose face. I don't know how my 3 minutes passed away. I have no memory. I'm just very happy. I just want to have a good meal with my family now. On the day before the finals, we decided to visit the villages around Dhanva, which had been coined by Chinese National Geographic as the most beautiful. Dawa was our young driver, and he was quite handsome as men from Daofu, where he was from, were. He said, "Come men are famous, but men from Daofu, where I come from, are the best. Men from Dhanva are also famous, but they are famous as drunkards, smokers, and as Tibetans with the worst fashion sense. That's why men from Daofu have many affairs, while girls from Daofu become nuns." So eventually we get caught into a love affair which he was running with a couple of other women. I wouldn't talk about that. For that, I hope that you will get the book and know more about it. So I'll stop here, Julia, and thanks a lot for inviting me and for listening to me and about this book. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shivaji. Beautiful pictures indeed. I'll go straight into my first question, which in a slightly different way is also asked on the web. So let me just set it up here. Now, other travel writers, of course, have trod the path of Shangri-La before you. At the top of my head, I can think about Joseph Rock, the eccentric Swiss-American botanist, explorer, and National Geographic writer who famously traveled the area in the 1920s in a suit, tie, and a pith helmet with his own bathtub, and his massive entourage, including his own chef. And 30 years earlier, you have the intrepid Isabella Bird, who is 63 at this point, and also in the region, writing, and I quote from her book, that she wrote that the grandeur and beauty of the region exceeded anything I have ever seen, Switzerland, Kashmir, Tibet in one. And she called this area the beyond. Bruce Chatwin, I think, didn't go as far up north. He stayed in Yunnan, I believe. But anyway, my question is, which authors inspired you to take this particular trip? The question is also asked on the web. How did you find your interest in this Sino-Tibetan landscape? And perhaps which other travelers or writers admire, or do you admire in general, and why?
Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting question, and there's a bit of a bold ambition there, which is beyond my capabilities. So because of my sort of family, in the way that I'm married to a Chinese person, and I come from India, and there are these ancients, the likes of Kumarajiva, Padma Sambhav, and others, and the other way as well, Yuan Sang. So there have been these great travelers who have written about their accounts of India, China, Tibet, and all these places. So they have always been in my mind that perhaps these things which were happening up to maybe 600 years ago have suddenly stopped. There are very few bridges which are now being built between these three great civilizations. So there was this thing in my, somewhere in the mind that maybe I could replicate some of that. And I don't know if I've achieved that, and I'm sure that I'm still very far away from what they all achieved. But that was in my mind. Beyond that, the books that you mentioned, Joseph Rock's account was definitely something I followed as well. And then not necessarily related to this region, but the Tibetan Xinjiang region as a whole. So Vikram Seth's book, Heaven's Lake, as well as Marjian's Travelogue All Over China, Red Dust. These have been very influential for me. And overall, if you talk about travel writing or more like reportage, I really admire the likes of Ryszard Kapuscinski, the great Polish journalist, as well as some of V.S. Naipaul's earlier works, travel writing works. So they have been really very inspirational for me. And I think I kind of try to copy their style and their approach when it comes to travel.
And they inspired this interest in the landscape as well. So that's for our webinar watchers, that question. Now, I told you I love your prose. It's funny, it's poetic, and I think it really captures something that comes out so clearly in your writing, and that's humanity, and the common humanity that we all share, but perhaps also the different humanity out there. So we get a lot from you about the incredible hospitality of people that you encounter. You describe children's smiles. There's the scene when you and your wife cross the river, and there's the broad smile of a small girl welcoming you on the other side of the river as you're drying off. You're pulling faces at older children, an awful lot in this book, but it is an expression of that common humanity. The love affair that you were alluding to earlier is certainly one, as is the love affair between the young new hotel owner and the lady that recommends that you go and see and stay in this hotel. So we're not so different after all. But there was one sentence in the context of your being with the nomads that really struck me. So you're staying in the nomad tent, and you write on page 43, the tent, I quote, was at once the happiest place on earth and the most miserable too. And I wanted to invite you to talk about this. Perhaps we have to contextualize it. You're, of course, talking about the 8-year-old daughter of your host here who doesn't go to school, but perhaps there's also a more general statement here about our common humanity and perhaps our differences. So there you go. It's a wonderful quote. The tent was the happiest place on earth and the most miserable too.
And it's not so much of my writing maybe, but it's just when you travel. And one of the reasons I travel, I consider myself a traveler first, and writing comes much later. I've traveled a lot more than I've written about. And the thing I really look forward to in all these is not that I will be writing about it, but more that just the experience of travel. Because whenever you travel, and not just to this part of the world, but to anywhere in the world we have been, there are these there are these small gestures of kindness, small gestures of helping complete strangers, and you can kind of put your whole life at the mercy of these strangers because of this trust that comes in. And that is the main reason why I've been traveling, and I love traveling, because that kind of always reaffirms that life is good, and it's good to continue even if it's short. And the other thing is that when you are traveling and you are in different socio-cultural contexts, there are always these opportunities for humor, because you are not used to their way of doing things and they are not used to their way of doing things. So it's somehow humor comes naturally when you are traveling, and that's something I always enjoy. You are having fun with languages, accents, behaviors, looks, everything. And that's what I tried to put in this book as well. Now, with reference to that particular sentence, yeah, I was kind of struck by that moment as well, because at one point, this was like such a beautiful area where you had the magnificent snow mountain, the Yellow Mountain in the backyard. You had this beautiful stream, and the whole Milky Way was visible from that point. And you had this family which was kind of living the urban person's dream of pastoral ideal, where everything you need is available from the yaks or from the nature itself. You don't need to do anything more. Everything is self-sufficient. So there was this thing, and then also the way we were greeted into the nomad families. The children obviously were the most enamored to us, but even the women, the men of the household, they were very generous with us, with the way they were treating us. And I had a lot of fun just playing games with this young girl who was just 8 years old. And the very unfortunate thing was that she was not going to school while her younger brother was going to the school. So there is a bit of that thing, the gender issue when it comes to preference for educating their children in some of these communities. But also other things, such as this girl of 8 years, her world was limited to just the 100 kilometers. She knew only within the 100 kilometers of her camp, because the furthest, we were playing a game of geography, and the farthest she would go was to Kangding, which was 100 kilometers away, and she didn't know the world beyond that. So in a sense, both this lack of education, the opportunity, as well as this smallness of the world, kind of made me think about how much of human potential we are losing, not just in this case, but in many other such unfortunate situations. But also you had the husband in this whole, in this tent, who was suffering from a cough and a fever for many days. And at the same time, all he needed was maybe just one ibuprofen or paracetamol. And when I gave it to him the next day, he was fine, but he was suffering from that for many days. And life expectancy among the nomads is much lower than other Tibetans, the average Tibetan and people in that region. And then just the whole difficulty in managing the cleanliness, controlling the infections and all that in that place was there. So at one point there was all this self-sufficiency and the beauty of nature and all that, but at the same time you saw all that discrimination, gentle discrimination, the potential, human potential, which was probably not going to be utilized to any limit, and then these imbalances or inequalities in access to even basic things, which struck me. So that was what led to that line.
Mm. I'll ask you about gender in a minute, but before we go there, let me pick up on the Milky Way. It's one of my favorite scenes in this travelogue, the same night that you were alluding to just now. So emotions are running high between you and your wife, because you mentioned your host is sick and is coughing, and your wife is starting to worry what will happen to you if the two of you fall ill on this trip, because the nearest help is quite a long way away. You're also afraid of the host dog, and then it's the middle of the night and you need to go to the bathroom. So the two of you very bravely venture out into the night, and you're rewarded by the most amazing sky, seeing the Milky Way. It's a beautiful poetic moment here. So I do want to ask you, about your favorite experiences in nature and with nature on this trip.
Yeah, I mean that moment was very special, and it all began with this requirement to go and go to the toilet in nature, and in a way, unfortunately, because of that. But there were too many such experiences with nature to count. Of course, there is this whole Yading Reserve with its mountains, valleys, autumn colors. There are the balmy forests with their spectacular autumn colors, the Tagong grasslands. So anywhere we go, there were these Instagram hashtags like Instagood and beautiful, hash beautiful, always surrounding us. So it was always around us. But having said that, I don't usually appreciate nature that much. I must say that even though I became a vegetarian out of conscience, and partly it has to do with nature and its preservation, but memories of nature, even though the experience at that very particular point of time is something beyond I can explain in words, but that memory kind of fades away. And what really stays with me is the experiences of dealing with people, interacting with people, and those conversations. So nature kind of formed a beautiful backdrop to this whole experience. But I'll still say that it was the people and the cultures that we encountered that really made this trip worthwhile for me. But to answer your question, there were two instances which were, I wouldn't say like the most amazing, but the most startling or thought-provoking in that sense. So one was the whole Chengdu, the Panda Sanctuary that you have in Chengdu. I think that was where I went alone. I found it very interesting that at the gift shop at the Chengdu Sanctuary, there were maybe thousands more soft toys of the giant panda than there were actually pandas in the sanctuary itself. So that made me wonder whether that's the future of how we will know wildlife as soft toys, cuddly toys, or rather than as real animals. And the other experience, which is kind of natural experience, was at the sky burial itself, where the Tibetan practice is to chop up body parts to make it easier for the vultures to consume. And there was this vulture which, after it had eaten the dead body, was just looking at me straight into the eye and then flew really close to me. And that was something of an experience as well. Like that made me think that life is really short, and this vulture wants me to just not bother more and just become food for itself. So those were some of the experiences with nature that really struck me, rather than being most beautiful, most thought provoking, I would say.
Now, we talked about women earlier, and I want to ask a few questions about gender. And just now you are talking about the protection of nature and the possible impact that tourism might have on our planet. And this is, of course, talking politics with a small p, isn't it? You say very clearly in your prologue that you are, of course, writing about an area that invites debate, and just being there and using words like Tibetan, Chinese, Sino, you are inviting debate. But you're very clear, and you say this, that, I quote, the travelogue should not be seen as an attempt to provide any verdict on the conflict. And of course, that is true. Travel writing is writing, travel writing is literature. And yet, from what I hear and from what you and I as writers know, is anything we talk or write about contains politics with a small p, whether we talk about nature and its protection or we talk about women. So you were reading out from the book a very remarkable scene, the beauty contest in Dhanva. And I want to ask you about women in this part of the world, because we see female nomads, we see mothers, we see beauty queens in the pageant, we see women participating in the tourist economy, we hear of polyandry and polygamy, as your driver Dawa and his partner are clearly not delivering noodles to a friend. So you were saying earlier that women up there are strong in character. Is there anything else that struck you about these women that you met?
Yeah, and I was kind of fortunate. There's a lot of women and female characters in this book, and that happens to be in most of my travel work as well. And that partly happens perhaps because I usually go for these long trips with my wife, and she interacts with a lot of these women, and I'm interested in what she hears and what she feels. And many times the experience of travel can be very different for myself and for my wife. Now, in this region, of course, I also did a lot of research to support what I saw and what I felt. In general, the Tibetan communities have been more gender friendly in that sense, more women friendly in that sense. You didn't have the kind of patriarchy you had in China or in Indian civilization. You didn't have that kind of a situation, or infanticide, those kind of things you didn't have. But nonetheless, there were evidences of discrimination. For instance, the nuns were clearly second grade in all the monasteries that we visited. We saw women, children, girl child being not educated in many of the nomad families, like I mentioned. And they were also doing a lot of these tedious work and a lot of these boring kind of works, I would say. The men would drive the yak around while the women would be stuck into a tent and doing the milk and all the laborious but slightly more mundane work. Similarly, they would be the ones who will be running the shops and the restaurants, while the men will be going around towns getting the deliveries and the deals arranged. So they were doing the more fun stuff or the cool stuff, if I can say, while the women were kind of stuck or tethered to a certain location. And the work was not anywhere less, it was probably a lot more. And many Tibetan women we came across, they did say that the men are actually just relaxing all the time and having a good time, going to the tea houses, while we are the ones who are doing all the work. We meet a lot of such Tibetan entrepreneurs who had come up, who complained about that as well. And then also you had a lot of improvements which have happened in the last few years from what we see. There have been material improvements, not just because of government intervention, but also within the community itself, particularly in the Tibetan community outside of China, in places like India and all, because of the interaction with the West. Concepts like feminism and all have made formal inroads in that sense of the word into these communities. So nuns, for example, they couldn't graduate to a certain level in the past. Now they're able to graduate. So those things are happening, but it's still a very much work in progress, as in any society. Even the most fancy society which has managed to reach the most of equality, they are still struggling with this whole gender imbalance issue. So it still remains a work in progress, in my opinion.
Absolutely right. I have a question on the web that is very specific, so I'll just read it out. Were you able to visit Sarta as a tourist or in a tourist group, or before it got closed to tourists? I went to Tagong area a few years ago. Beautiful. So that's a question about how you managed to travel on your own or in a tour group.
No, we never went in a tour group. Into all these places, we were traveling as independent travelers. But we did come across many Chinese travel tour groups. Wherever we went, we couldn't miss them. And I don't mind that experience. I really enjoy being with these big Chinese tour groups because they're always very funny and always, if you know the language, I always enjoy those smart comments which keep coming from these different people in these Chinese tour groups. But to answer the question, no, we were always traveling independently, taking shared vans, hitchhiking sometimes. We were always doing that to go to these places.
Okay, now to liven things up a bit and to change the format, are you willing to do a quick fire round with me?
Sure.
So let's do that. Favorite dish you had on your trip?
So food was a challenge, especially being a vegetarian and the monopoly of Sichuan cuisine. But for me, it would be capsicum butter rice and milk tea. Not the yak butter tea, but the milk tea.
Best hotel you stayed in?
So there was a hotel called Grand Hotel, which had like 10 inches of dust on all the beds and the floors were all cracked. But just because its name was Grand Hotel, I would say that was the best hotel I stayed in. But in terms of experience, it was clearly it was not a hotel, but staying with the nomads in the tent.
The worst experience you had on this trip?
Oh, in the famous Luding Bridge, which was famous for the journey of the Red. During the Long March, the Red Army crossed the Luding Bridge. Today, the modern day bridge, when we travel, there was like a horrendous traffic jam and we were stuck there for almost 7 hours, if I'm not wrong.
How does the story end with the big Tibetan mastiff that you found on the road and were dreaming of selling and thus making a fortune? How does the story end?
The story doesn't end very well for me. I'm still where I was in terms of my bank balances. But in terms of the Tibetan Mastiff, I do hope it didn't end up in any hot pot, as some of the Tibetan Mastiffs during the economic slowdown, they ended up in the hot pot because the owners just couldn't afford to sustain them.
I don't know whether everybody knows, not just how big these Tibetan Mastiffs are. Isabella Bird said they're bear rather than dog, but they're also incredibly precious and valuable and sold for thousands of dollars right now, right? Your favorite monastery or temple?
Yeah, for me, it would still be the whole Larung monastery complex, just because of the complexity in its history, in its structure, and all the multitude of characters, whether it be Han or Tibetan, that we met in that monastery.
Well, thank you for the quick fire round. I have a question again on the web, which I wanted to ask you as well, and it's about next trip or traveling. So the question on the web is, with global travel coming to a pause right now, how will travel writing look like for you in the coming year or years?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting perspective, and about which I've written as well, how the future of travel writing would look like. Of course, now it's a bit of a unique situation because of the pandemic, and hopefully this will resolve soon. And the only impact I can think of is that maybe you will have greater inequality coming in, that certain countries will be able to visit and they will be visiting each other. So there could be a lack of understanding as a result of that, at least for the next 1 or 2 years. But if I really look long-term traveling and travel writing, it's going to evolve in different ways based on where you are coming from. For instance, I just read some statistics that in places like India or China or Indonesia, less than 3% of the people have passports. So there is this big chunk of people who are yet to travel, and they will become travelers someday. So there's no end to it, no matter how much Instagram or Google image search and TripAdvisor reviews make it possible to see how a place might look like or how a festival might look like. So I don't think there's any end to traveling. And moreover, I think in terms of travel writing as such, many of these more popular means of travel writing, such as listicles like top 10, top 20, those things will probably be written by an AI engine, artificial intelligence engine. But when it comes to individual experiences going more in depth, I believe there will still be possibilities for a travel writer if he or she has that skill to bring out that nature. To me, travel writing is not can never capture the essence of a place, because even during this trip that we took, it's very hard, or it's not right for me to say that this is how the Sino-Tibetan frontier looks like, because we met only maybe 30 people and they're not representative of the whole population over there. And each of them have different characteristics which evolve. And all of these has possibilities for stories and possibilities for new experiences. So that's why, in my belief, even though it's possible to do space travel or do instant travel in a thought machine, traveling and travel writing will still prosper for the next few hundred years, if I'm not wrong.
Do you know, I was just thinking that we have had moments in history and literary history before where, of course, traveling wasn't possible. I'm thinking of, the Grand Tour, which basically came to an end when France and England were in conflict with one another in the early 19th century. And then we see travelers and writers going back to the Lake District or going back into their immediate surroundings, rather than, by boat to a foreign country. So it'll be interesting to see what will come, whether there will be more cycling and accounts of that, more walking again. It'll be interesting to see what travel writing does. Absolutely. Now, here's another question as we're slowly nearing the end of our evening. What do you think is the thing that you took away mostly from this journey to the Sino-Tibetan frontier in Sichuan, and perhaps took away against your expectations?
So, of course, there is all the nature, the beauty of it, and those pictures which are in the hard drive and in the book as well. And there's also the interactions with the people, many of whom I'm still in touch with and I talk to even now. So all those are there. But for me, I would say there are two things which really struck me the most. And one is very personal in that sense that, for both myself and my wife, we claim to be like citizens of the world. We are not 0% patriotic. We don't have any nationalistic, religious, any affiliation. So we think we are like completely bereft of any such national, cultural narratives of superiority of one over the other. But it was happening that during this trip, during this long trip, when I was struggling with the food because of the monotony and the difficulty in having vegetarian stuff, we were having a bit of a conflict. Well, my wife was trying to defend the Chinese cuisine and the glory of it, and I was trying to say, no, we have far better things back in my culture. And then it went to, oh, how does your teams compare in Olympics, and how does your ancient literature compare to your ancient literature? So, despite me claiming to be like a citizen of the world free of such biases, there was something very deep inside which I suddenly became conscious of because of this Sichuan chili pepper and its monopoly during this trip. So, I'm thankful to it, at least for that. And the other thing that struck me was this whole Tibetan attitude towards death and towards the whole nature and the landscape. I mean, again, I'm not a spiritual person. I'm a very material person. I'm not a religious person at all. But this whole beauty and imagery created by the culture to deal with death, if you read the whole Tibetan Book of the Dead, how you try to chant or imagine certain characters so that you can avoid the opening vagina so that you don't get into your next life. All this fantastic imagery and imagination just to be able to deal with that, and that first-hand experience of that through sky burials and talking to the monks and others. That was something very striking for me as well, that this whole civilization kind of dealing with death and temporality. That was quite amazing for me. So yeah, these two experiences.
One more question that I need to sneak in, because I was talking to a colleague earlier about the sky burials, and weirdly enough, he had just read something this weekend, and we saw one of the pictures in your presentation with the vultures, with the birds of prey. Do you just want to explain what the sky burials are and why they happen the way that they happen?
Yeah, so it's a way of dealing with the corpse when a Tibetan person has died it's particularly in those highlands. So instead of cremating or instead of burying or burning the dead body, you usually feed it to vultures. And once the vultures have consumed the face, that's an ideal that the vulture consumed the face, which is a good sign. To make it easy for the birds to consume the rest of the body, they are chopped into pieces by someone, and then they are spread and fed out to the birds. So it may seem a very shocking practice to many people, but I'm kind of familiar with it because in Iran and the Parsi community in India as well, it's practiced in a similar way, that the dead bodies are dumped into towers and then the vultures kind of consume them over time. But apart from the shock element of this thing, the reality is that because of the nature of the landscape, where the soil is very thin, it's almost impossible to bury. You can't just put the body in a stream because it will pollute the water downstream. And you can't burn the body as well because there's no firewood at that kind of an altitude. So it makes perfect scientific sense to deal with the dead body in that way. But also, I think there is an element to it that once the person has died, the body has no meaning for the Tibetan person. Yeah? So it's whether you are chopping it, whether you are dealing with it in a certain way, it has very little implication in terms of the respect you are paying to that dead person. Now, it's a very different death culture, death ritual than what I have seen in places like Indonesia, where the dead are sort of buried with elaborate garments, and then the dead body is brought out every year to take them for a walk. These dead bodies are taken out for a walk. So there are these very different ways of dealing with the dead. But in Tibet, that's what they practice, and it's no less fascinating and makes perfect scientific sense as well.
I feel bad ending this evening on the notion of death. So let me just say that there's so much life in your travel writing. There's so much humanity. There's so much warmth. There's so much affection, and it's funny as well as touching. I enjoyed reading it immensely, and I hope that many other people will read it. So here's the last question from the web, which is a very simple one. It says, "How do we buy your new book, and where do we buy it?"
Thank you, thank you. So the publisher, of course, is based out of India, so it's available in all bookstores in India and in physical format. Because of COVID-19, the international shipping of the book has been a bit challenging, but the ebooks are available on Amazon everywhere. I think they are available on Amazon. We just got the shipment in Singapore, so I hope the publisher will be able to ship it to Hong Kong as well. My other books are available in Hong Kong. You can check out some of the bookstores. But as of now, I believe at least for the next 1 month or so, if you can check out the Amazon website for the ebook, that would be the best place.
Great, thank you. So we're out of time, sadly. So let me end by expressing my deepest thanks to Shivaji Das, whose travel book, The Other Shangri-La, is available in Hong Kong and elsewhere, we hope. Thanks, Shivaji, for a fascinating talk and conversation and presentation. Thank you to the Asia Society for hosting us tonight. And thanks to you all out there for tuning in with a bit of a delay. We appreciate your being there. We hope to see you again soon at another webinar, or if indeed we're lucky and things go a little bit better, perhaps we'll see each other in person soon. So good night to everybody. Good night to Singapore. Thank you, Shivaji, and have a good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye.